Well, I guess I'll need to apologize. I was told that the wind that was whistling in one of my ears and coming out the other was creating a whistling noise in here this morning. So I apologize for that, but I've tried to fill it up a little bit. At least I had lunch. And so now we'll go from there. Self-made versus God-made. So far in this class, we've looked at the idea that if we're going to have a Bible-based life, we set in motion and start with this idea that God is active, that He isn't passive, that He's around us at all times working, that we're not here to get, but we're here to contribute in this life. And that doesn't mean just in the plate on a Sunday morning, but it's talking about life in general. We've talked about this idea of generosity and how cruel greed can be, because it can be so sneaky. It can creep up on us, and we find ourselves slipping into that attitude without even thinking about it. In the same way, we looked at individualism versus community, and we saw that God wants us to work in a community of people. It doesn't mean that we can't move to a place and start a congregation somewhere, because that's what they did in the New Testament. But it does mean that the idea is that we rely on others, and we allow others, and we encourage others to rely on us. And in doing so, there's two things there that I just want to point out. That we have the individualism, we have those that have, grown up with the idea, particularly in school, that, every time I had to do group work, I had to do it. And the rest of them just sat there and, fed off me. And the other thing, and so it's hard to be in community. The other is the opposite, and that is the person who so wants to be fed by others that they basically want to almost, I don't want to be rude with it, but they also want to glom onto you, and they have to tell you every one of their troubles every single time. And you have to solve their problems every single time. Well, what they're doing and ignoring is the other side of the coin. How are you helping others? You're expecting others to help you, but what are you doing on the other side? So we see that community. We see that, yes, in this country we have individual rights, but the only really real rights that we have are that freedom that's given us in Christ. And that freedom is that we have an ability to break away from Satan. We looked at nationalism versus God of all nations, and we saw, it's kind of sneaky. It can sneak up on us then all of a sudden. I heard last Sunday a sermon, people talking about, I love this country, and I don't have a problem with that. But it kind of went on a little bit further of, that this country is better than every other country ever. And that may be the case, and that may be more of my generation kind of looking and going, because I'm kind of at the tail end of I'm an old boomer, or a young boomer, I guess it is. And so I'm kind of in that 60s and 70s where I kind of look at that and go, that kind of bothers me when we say we're just so wonderful here, that nobody ever has been as good as our country has been. Because it almost touches on God saying, you're special, people. And then we also looked last week at pride versus humility, and that idea of a humble person. I use Moses as an example of someone who showed pride in the very beginning of his life and who showed humility at the end of his life. In fact, as was pointed out in class a couple of weeks ago, God is the one that says that Moses was the most humble person who ever lived. Imagine that, the same guy who younger in his life acted in a certain way, grew into something else. That, I think, gives us confidence. This week, we're looking at self-made versus God-made. And I'd like to give you two things to start with and to think about. And they're really kind of, it doesn't look like there's much there, but I think these are actually quite profound. You don't hear me say that very often. That's a word I don't try to use. First is this: in our visible world, we serve an invisible God. Hopefully right now you're looking at that statement and saying, I can find, even if I can't remember exactly where it's at, I know the stories in the Bible that tell me that God is visible, that we serve him, but that he is invisible, that we can't see him with our eyes, touch him with our fingers, those type of things. We see the attributes of him, but we don't see him. And the second thing is this, and please think about this, those of you that have a want to do this. He allows us to choose whether we acknowledge or ignore him. I think this is the only religion that we study, that you will study, where the God allows you to ignore them if you want to. Think about all these others. Think about all the ones that you have, whatever they happen to be. I don't want to mention names and get into things, but just getting that idea that God, God has given you free will in the sense that if you said, I want to ignore you, God, he will allow you to ignore him. With that in mind, the phrase self-made has become one of the foundational ideas of our country. Henry Clay, 1820s, tariffs. Let's see if I can make your eyes get really heavy right now. A protective tariff is a tax placed on, that used to drive me crazy. I mean, I had professors that would do that. And we would go into long, detailed discussions of tariffs. I don't care what a tariff is. I know what a tariff is, and I don't really care. A tariff was a tax. This is no point. In his speech, this guy gets up and says, you know something? That our good people in Kentucky, that's where he was from, he was a senator there, off and on for like 50 years, and said, they have started from scratch. They've started without anything. They were self-made men. That's where the term comes from. And really, it gets its biggest deal, its biggest boost, not from Henry Clay. Shouldn't have done this. But you know who. I just finished a biography of the guy. That also bored me to death. It told what he did every single day of his life. The abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass with 2 S's on Douglass. Frederick Douglass, when he ran away from slavery and started giving speeches, which he did immediately, they found this guy was a good speaker, just natural, that he then started talking about how he had nothing, but he made himself into something. And that idea of the self-made man propelled his life, and that goes all the way to about 1900. And it gets picked up in modern America. The idea of the self-made man was a big thing in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s. In the 60s, it gets its first criticism. 70s and 80s, it's not, in fact, you won't even hear that term in history classes today, the idea of self-made man. But for many of us, even today, it means something. It means that the idea that a person can, through hard work and perseverance, coach, doesn't this sound familiar? Through hard work and perseverance, it gives you hope that you can have a better future in sports and talent. But how many times have we emphasized the hard work and the perseverance? That has been an American attitude, and it's been ingrained in most of us, especially in this area. A Pew Research study called the Economic Mobility Project said 71% of the people who responded said that personal attributes were the key factors to success, as opposed to things like birth, who your parents were, or those kind of things. It's what you had going for you. And the idea that it says we gravitate to the exceptional stories of people overcoming odds. After all, isn't that what Rocky is about? Pushing through. We can be thankful for inspirational stories that encourage us to achieve. But sometimes what it also does as Christians, it can lead to an unhealthy individualism. Sometimes that individualism that feel that we can do this through my hard work, I can get this done. Sometimes it encourages us to believe certain things. For example, it can encourage us to believe that when I make a mistake, it's usually due to external factors. When I make a mistake, I can give you an excuse for it. Not just an explanation, but an excuse for it. But not because it's never something that's wrong with me. It's always an outside thing that causes me to fail. Or when someone else gets it wrong, I tend to think it's because they have something wrong with them. It's a flaw in their personality. They're just, and not because of something happening around them. This works at a level that I think you would be surprised how often we do have it, but we don't think about it. And again, this is the reason for a Bible-based life, that we go back and we recognize these things to do the best we can of working with them. Here's an example. I was in a tight financial spot because all these things came at me immediately, and I was unprepared. But he's in a tight financial spot because he makes bad money decisions. Do you see the difference there? And what we're doing is we are judging other people and looking inside their brains and deciding what their motivations are and their actions. Not just their outwardly actions, but the motivations behind those actions. My business succeeded because of my hard work and determination. Her business succeeded because she caught a bunch of lucky breaks. I've heard people say that. That's the only reason they're getting along. They just got lucky. Here's Isaiah, the 29th chapter. We're going to read verses 13 and then 15 and 16. We'll skip 14 at this time. And the Lord said, because this people draw near with their mouth and honor me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me, and their fear of me is a commandment taught by men. Verse 15, ah, you who hide deep from the Lord your counsel, whose deeds are in the dark, and who say, who sees us? Who knows us? You turn things upside down. Shall the potter be regarded as the clay, that the thing made should say to its maker, he did not make me? Or the thing formed say of him who formed it, he has no understanding. In Isaiah, the 45th chapter, in verse 9, woe to him who strives with him who formed him. Got to get the hymns straightened out here to understand this one, don't we? A pot among earthen pots. Does the clay say to him who forms it, what are you making? Or, your work has no handles. What I want us to do now is just think about those passages for a second, and thinking about the Old and the New Testament. What are some examples from the Old and New, either one, of the clay believing it is superior to the potter? You can tell a little bit of the story or just give the name. That's okay, whatever. Think about that for a second. Example of the clay feeling it is superior to the potter.
When God tells Moses to go speak to Pharaoh, Moses says, I am not.
Okay, when Moses, good. Robert?
Naaman, who refused to wash in the Jordan because it was a muddy river.
It was the kern. And so, yes. A good teacher waits. A good teacher who wants to be hated waits too long, and then people get mad at him for waiting. Go ahead, Susan. Prodigal son, good. Adam and Eve. And this is one of the things that I know you know, but sometimes I just have to state the obvious so I can understand it. And here's one of those obvious things. People that don't have an understanding of the Bible really don't understand that the Bible basically is full of mistakes. It's people's mistakes, and God is teaching by way of those mistakes. He's not saying go ahead and do all these things. So the Bible is not a perfect, it's not, be careful how you say that, Larry. It's not a book of perfect people being perfect. That's better. It's a book of people being people, and God saying, This is how I can take a clay. When you do clay sometimes with your kids, and do you thump it on the thing like they do on TV? And do you pound it? And if you don't like what it's made, what it turns out, you just pound it again? Now there's a joke there that I can barely, pass, but I will. I won't say anything about his first name. And so, she just, but imagine, what is the passage saying? That lumpless clay looks and goes, excuse me, you didn't make me without it. You made me without handles. I just find that interesting. You didn't make me to my satisfaction. Self-made man. I've worked hard all my life. I've made a lot of money, friends. I've had success in whatever way you want to count success. And after a while, why should I look at anyone else? After all, I wasn't the clay. I was the potter. And I think that's what we see here. Here's a question. Why would the potter be offended? You work hard at making something. Someone comes and looks at it immediately. We'll just do the first thing in the mind and goes, that's horrible. You don't know what you're doing. How do you feel? For some of us, and it's not me, you kind of, it bounces off and you go, okay, bye. And for others, you go, well, that hurt my feelings a little bit. I kind of wanted to make something kind of, I wanted the ashtray to no, we don't make ashtrays anymore, do we? Okay. Boy, I dated myself on that one. Okay. I wanted it to kind of look like a pot. Go ahead, Claire.
Well, I was thinking there's actually two reasons that would be the case. One, it would be offensive because it's claiming to do a better job than God does.
Mm-hmm.
And two, it would be offensive because it's an exhibiting a level of pride that would be very unacceptable.
Yeah, so it's pride and also that idea of, well, God, you didn't do really well on that one. And that's why we have our third. Why is the clay's, or go ahead.
Yeah, just thinking about just like, I think we experience this in life person to person. I think about myself in the workplace, and there's been some embarrassing times when I try to challenge people or maybe act like the clay to the potter who was my boss, who's been in the company for 30 years. He makes some comment, and all of a sudden you kind of get this sort of like God back to Job, like, why don't you explain to me since you know better? And so this is something where maybe it's easier for us to see when it's visible human to human, and it's harder to see when it's the invisible God.
And that's true. It is, we just don't think about it. Maybe that's what I'm getting at here. We just don't think about it. I mean, when it's called to our attention, we could do two things. Isn't that right? I mean, if it's called to our attention that we're doing that, we could do maybe more than two. I can only think of two. One, I could think about it and do something about it, or two, I can deny it. My first thing will be to deny it. Because that's what people do. First thing is deny. First thing people do is lie. I'm sorry, but you get that in teaching. First thing the kid's going to do is lie. Not every kid, but in general, the first thing they're going to do. Why? Because they're afraid of getting caught. They're afraid of consequences, and to them, a lot of times, consequences, they don't even know what consequences means. They just know it's something out there. I've known of kids who have no fear of their parents at all. In fact, their parents are afraid of them. I'm not making that up. Who will cry or would cry in school if you said, I'm going to need to call your parents about this. Oh, don't call them. Don't call them. Why? Because it's just the first thing that hits them. Deny. And then if you ask them later, you go, hey, I just want to know we're just talking. All right? Then they'll kind of backtrack, and then they'll go from there. Isn't that what we do in life? We deny first, and then hopefully we don't keep down that road of denial, but we take a step back and we kind of go, okay, here's some consequences I'm going to have to face. That's what we tell our kids constantly do. But in this case, that ground is awfully shaky because they don't have the right to tell. Here's Deuteronomy, the 8th chapter, and verses 10 through 17. And you shall eat, here's God speaking to Israel again, and you shall eat and be full, and you shall bless the Lord your God for the good land he has given you. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you today. Lest when you have eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied, then your heart be lifted up, and you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground where there was no water, who brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do good work in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, my power and the might of my hand have gotten me this wealth. Why is it so easy for us to believe that we're doing it by our power and strength? Go ahead, Mike.
Is it easy to say, like, I'm looking at all these physical things, all these things that have accumulated, but I can't see God physically. So is it easy to get just stuck in that mindset to say, well, look at everything that I have, that it's easy to forget, well, who's the person who gave it to me?
I think that's it. I think that's what I'm kind of getting at here. The point I really wanted to make this evening was this idea as we look at a self-made man, because God has given us the privilege of self-will, and it is a privilege. He's not making us obey him. It's so easy to take advantage of it. And then again, to deny that we're taking advantage of it. And so, since he's not there, how could the Israelites forget God's act in the past and also fail to attribute similar present blessings to him? It's a long question that simply says, how come they did it? How come they messed up so much? It's probably an easier way of putting it. Why did Israel mess up so much? I don't know how you're going to answer that, by the way, in a sentence or so. Well, I'd like to read the book of Exodus and for you and tell you. But instead, what I'm getting at here is this idea that they were given something. What were they given? They were given, God, in a sense, God's grace, his unmerited favor. They were given promises. And yeah, they were told you had to do certain things along with it, but they were given these promises. And from that time on, they seemed to be more the children of promise than the children of God. Once we get the things, why is it harder for a person with money to be a Christian in this society than a person with little money? Or is it? Is it more difficult to be a Christian in our society with a lot of money than a person without a lot of money?
It's the focus on what you're wanting to get.
Okay, and
I think it goes right along with
is there going to be a bigger focus if you have more money?
more money, more things, and I think Randy hit it nail on the head with this lesson this morning is because we can go out there, we can borrow, we can get bigger things. And when we get bigger things, we may become bored with them and want even bigger things with them. And that's your question back to the Israelites, your Deuteronomy passage hits that on the head. They became very complacent because they had everything that they needed from God.
Now I'm going to go with this. Is there any, I had to sit down for a second, I'm sorry. Is there any congregation mentioned in the New Testament that is not criticized for anything. Not criticized in any way, shape, or form in any of its mentions.
One of the 7 churches in
And it's only mentioned that one time, isn't it, in all the New Testament. So we've got one in a particular mention that's surrounded by others. Well, what point am I trying to make here? I'm pointing out that when a bunch of people come together and said they're going to serve Christ, over time, it's hard to keep it up and keep doing what you're doing. The consistency, especially if you are being successful in this life. There's nothing wrong with being successful in life. Who was it that helped pay most of Jesus, as near as what evidence we have in the New Testament, helped to supply Jesus and his apostles with the funds to be able to wonder where they did?
The 3 Marys and the other women.
Yeah, there were other women, and so we see those women, and those women seem to be fairly well off. There's nothing wrong with success. But it's a more difficult thing. What's difficult with having nothing? Notice I didn't say this because sometimes I'll hear, well, you know, if you have a lot of money, it's harder. If you don't have any money at all, it's easier. I don't think that's true. If you don't have any money at all, what are you faced with? Yeah. And the things that will come out, it's different kind of, what word am I help me out? Pressure, not deceit. I feel like, hey, that's a good one. I like that. Thank you. It's not what I was looking for, but it's better, I think. There's more challenges. And each one of those challenges can lead you down the wrong road. Isaiah 64:8. Oh, now, O Lord, you are our Father. We are the clay and you are our potter. We are all the work of your hand. What an interesting last line. It's declarative. It's not a, if, wish thing, we want to be. We are all the work of your hand. Why is it comforting to think of God as the potter? When we start thinking of God as the potter and we're the clay, what pressures does that take off us? You guys know what, I see some of you answering. If you're doing, that's good. That's what I want.
I don't have to be the one ultimately in control.
Yeah, I don't have to be the one. Give me some specific, that's good. Some kind of specific examples. Because if some of us are going to hear, oh, I don't have to be in control. Well, okay, that's true, but what does that mean for me? Okay, God's the potter.
He gives us choices. But don't you need kind of
Well, part of it, he gives us choice. He allows us
to make the right decision?
and allows us to, he gives us a decision where we can make the right decision, doesn't he? If God had not created the Bible, we today would have no idea of how to come to God. None. He calls us through his word. Sometimes that's a term that we use and we're kind of almost afraid of using because of its in other denominations, the idea of called. And so, but think about this for a second. It says God calls us. But how does he call us? He calls us, I read this one time, he calls us like a man looking for a spouse who he loves. He calls us by being gentle to us, by calling us to him. And how does he do? Go ahead, Robert.
Well, to answer the question you asked previously, Psalm 23 is one that comes to my mind. The picture of God as a shepherd that leads us beside the quiet waters and leads us to green grass and protects us in the shadow of the valley of death. That is, for me, the passage that I go to about God being in control
That's good. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
When you're creating something, as God is a potter, you don't want to give up on what you're doing. You're showing it the right way, and you're working it, and you don't want to give up.
That is, if God is the potter and we're the clay, how about, I'll say it this, what he's doing is he's molding us to a vessel that he can use. And how does he do that? Well, part of it, he challenges Larry in saying, you know, your ego is too big. You're going to have to work on it. Okay? Your temper is too much. You have to work on it. Your love for this is too much. This is one that I think he calls us to, that every congregation, which I've discovered, every congregation is simply made up of a contingent of interrelated families. Almost every congregation that I've ever been at is like that. Your love of your children and your parents cannot be greater than your love for him. And I know it's in the Bible, and I know we read it in the Bible, but it's difficult, isn't it? He challenges on those things, but what is he doing when he's challenging? Is he making it impossible for us to do? And if we don't understand exactly what to do, what can we ask him for? You're supposed to read my mind on that. That's a crummy question. Wisdom. But with Solomon, remember Solomon, though? He had knowledge and he had wisdom. He still didn't have the will to do them, at least part of his life. So you have to have the will and the wisdom and the knowledge. And that's what we kind of see here, I guess, as we see, why is it comforting to think of God as the potter? Because he has our best interest in mind. And he's skilled. And the first thing when I talk to someone, they'll go, well, you know, what if I trust God, I've never been able to trust anybody. And that's true. That's probably true. They probably never have trusted anyone. But how's this? How difficult is it to trust God entirely? Well, ask Peter. I am, I'm not. I am. His entire life, wasn't it? One of those. You shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth. This is Deuteronomy 8:18. That he may confirm his covenant that he swore to your fathers as it is in this day. So when he looks at these people and he says to Israel, hey, you know, you're going to have this land, you're going to have wealth. Who's giving them that wealth? The Lord. Who's giving you your wealth? The Lord. I thought that was kind of interesting. How does God's giving them the power to make money prove that he's keeping his promise? Because what was his covenant with them? Land and name. Then 3. Okay, let's do land. Land, okay? I've given it to you. And what do? They do what we do. Look what I made. It is like a little kid, except there's innocence in a little kid. They come up to you, look what I made, look what I made. And you've just helped them with it and put everything together, and they make one little squiggly. Look what I made. And it's cute there. But imagine God looking at that going, well, you know, for some it may be a good first step. How does the belief in being self-made complicate our ability to give credit to God? I'll ask this, do you know anyone that would fit into that idea of self-made men? Men or women that you've met in the past? Not necessarily Christians, but people that in the world they've gone, yeah, this guy's self-made. How's it going to be? Well, what do we spend on time? Kind of look up there. That's what I'm kind of getting at. What are the things that we've covered and looked at? We have to remember that first step. Oh, I'm sorry. Good. Thank you.
To my mind is Lance Armstrong. He actually got up there and said one time, God had nothing to do with my success. I did this all myself. And then he got caught with steroids.
And then he got caught with story out.
Like me.
Yeah. She goes, no. James, there we go. Oh, it is too. Yes, James. Sorry.
I was thinking not so much the net, but thinking interesting example of false self-made was Nebuchadnezzar. He made the claim, look at everything I've done, when it wasn't him, it was God who allowed it all to happen. So that was a false product.
Well, he was, and that's a good point. James is calling it the false self-made. And when you look at anyone that is self-made, if God has brought them to a thing, I guess a more accurate term would be falsely self-made, false self-made. But they are people that are there, and so we'll look at them. When we think about this, then what beliefs does it change for us if we are going to try to make sure we give credit to God? And maybe one of these things, I'd like to go back to that very first, or that slide that I said for us to think about. God's given us a choice. We can remember him or forget him. What happens in the Bible? Every time people stop remembering him and begin to forget him, bad things happen to them. Bad things happen to them. So yes, it's our choice, but he's giving us a grown-up choice in that sense. Next week then, if everything is all right, happiness versus joy. And I'll just give you a little preview just very quickly. Did you know that there is, according to the books that I read, because I don't know this for sure, that there is no original in the Hebrew or Greek, there is no word for happy the way we use happy today. The way people would say, God wants me to be happy. That word is not around at all. It's in some translations, happy, but it's a synonym for blessed. And so next week, we're going to look at, does God want us to be happy? And what is the difference between happiness and joyful? So we'll do that, and then we'll finish up at the third week of the month, and I'm worthless versus I am loved by God. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Well, first of all, is there anything? I always do that, and it's always people are getting up when I'm going, no, one more thing. Anyone want to say something? I dare you to raise your hand. No. Thank you.